Bad decisions. You've never made a bad decision, have you? Some of you are laughing. I don't know why. You know, bad decisions they're things that are commonplace. You know, when you think about the idea of making bad decisions, we all can relate to that because we all at some point in time have made a bad decision. Most of us can probably remember a time when we were a child, maybe many times when we were children, when our parents would tell us, don't do this. And we knew, hey, there's something that I'm not supposed to do. And then we go out and we do it, right? We do the very thing they say don't do. And then, you know, we're standing before our mom or our dad, or maybe both of them, and they say, what did I tell you? Well, you told me not to do it. Well, why did you do it? Well, I wanted to do it, right? We understand in that moment, wrong answer, bad decision, right? Or, you know, you maybe you're at school and, you know, you've been disrespectful to your teacher, and, you know, you get through the school day and you head home and you open the door, and as soon as you walk in the front door of your house, there stands your mom or your dad, and you can tell by the look on their face, bad decision. Or you get older and you know, you tend to sometimes make bad decisions as an adult. You know, I'm a husband, I'm a father, and yet in both of those areas at times, sometimes I make a bad decision. And I know that there are guys here today especially who can relate to that. Because, you know, you've had those moments, maybe for your anniversary, where, you know, you decided, hey, you were going to get your wife this gift that she had been asking for. I mean, she had mentioned that she needed a new one. She wasn't happy with the one she had. And so, you know, you were going to find the biggest and the best vacuum cleaner that you could find. And, you know, you're so excited. You go to present it to her. She's unwrapping that vacuum cleaner, and you're thinking, boy, I did well. She loves me. And you see the look in her eyes, and you know in that moment, bad decision. Or maybe it's with your children. You ever given your children sugar late at night? It doesn't take long to figure out when we do that, that's a bad decision. I remember several years ago, I had a student. We were at CYC in Gatlinburg at the time. And his family had just started coming to church with us there. And he was actually a fifth grader, wasn't technically in the youth group, but they had decided to go to CYC for the weekend. And on night 2, on Saturday night, I convinced his parents to allow this little fifth grader to stay in the room with me and like 3 or 4 of the senior high boys, the teenage boys, juniors and seniors. And they're like, I don't know if he's ready for this. I'm like, listen, he's fine. It won't do any harm. He can stay. I'll make him behave. We'll get him in bed at a decent hour. And I'm not sure why I promised that, but I did. And eventually they decided to let the little terror stay with us. And he came in, and I didn't know this, but he wasn't supposed to drink caffeine. And he drank a couple Mountain Dews while we were in the hotel room, and he was like bouncing on the bed all night long. And I remember in that moment thinking, man, what a bad decision. Like, this kid's never going with us again, right? Like, the thing about decisions is bad decisions, you know, we make them as children, and then they follow us all the way through adulthood. You know, we never outgrow making bad decisions. And the problem with bad decisions is when those bad decisions that we make end up affecting us spiritually. It's when the bad decisions that we make end up affecting our relationship with God, maybe even causing us to wander away from God. You know, last week we started a series on our theme, Equip, and I told you that today we were going to, you know, develop that a little bit more. But on Friday, because of the weather, I decided it was probably best to hold that lesson for next week, when more of our members could be here. So I changed the lesson, and this morning I want us to think about the impact of our decisions. And specifically, I want to look at a decision that this family made that we read about in the Old Testament. That at the time when they made that decision, they probably didn't realize the impact that decision would have on them and even their spiritual life. But nonetheless, they make this decision, and what I want us to do is see how that decision impacted them, and then what we can learn about decisions in our own lives. So if you have your copy of God's Word, go ahead and open up to the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1, we're just going to look at the first 5 verses this morning. Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his sons. So as the book of Ruth opens up, there's a couple things that jump out right at the very beginning of the story. Number one, we learned that it's during this time that there's a pretty difficult time going on in the land. There's a famine in the land. And, you start thinking about, okay, the idea that there's famine, food is probably, lacking at this point in time. And then you see how, before we read that there's a famine, what is recorded for us. The story of Ruth opens in the days of the judges. Well, if you know Bible history, then you understand that the time of the judges was a pretty difficult time for the people of Israel. And in fact, the very last verse of Judges chapter 21 and verse 25, tells us that in those days there was no king in Israel, for every man did what was right in his own eyes. And as you read through the book of Judges, that phrase is used 3 or 4 times throughout Judges. But what you'll notice is there's this repeated cycle. I often recall this the cycle of chaos. Because you see the people of Israel, and they'll be serving God, and then all of a sudden they'll become disobedient. They'll stop serving God, and God will raise up an oppressor who will come and oppress them for a certain period of time, usually several years at a time. They will eventually be upset about what has happened to them. They will cry out to God. God will raise up a deliverer. We call them a judge who will deliver them. There'll be a period of peace, and then they'll fall back into that cycle over and over again. That's the time frame of the story of Ruth. This story takes place in the time of the judges. So when you think about a famine being in the land, the Bible doesn't tell us why there was a famine in the land. Was the famine because there was not enough rain? Was the famine because there was too much rain? Was the famine because of the war? Was it because of pestilence? Was it because of disease? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us. But it does tell us in Leviticus chapter 26 and also in Deuteronomy chapter 28 that God would use famine to discipline his people for their spiritual rebellion. And when you think about the time frame, okay, this is in the time of the judges, a very corrupt time for Israel. It's not impossible to think about the fact that this famine was brought on Israel because of their own rebellious nature. So there's a famine in the land. So you get to verse number 2. And it says, the name of the man, Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and they have these 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they're from Bethlehem in Judah. And it says they go into the country of Moab and they remain there. So you have this story of this famine in the land, this family. They're living in Bethlehem. And it's interesting. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. They live in the house of bread. Judea means thanksgiving or praise. They're living in the house of bread, in the land of thanksgiving or the land of praise, but there's no bread. There's a famine in the land. And so what Elimelech does is he takes his family, he packs them up, and he moves his family, it says, to the country of Moab. Now, what do we know about Moab? Well, we know that Moab, the nation of Moab, comes and traces all the way back to the days of Lot and his incestuous relationship with his oldest daughter. Genesis chapter 19 and verse 37. That's where the Moabite people came from. As we read through the history of Israel, we learn that the Moabites become an enemy to Israel. You read Numbers 22 through 25 and you see the way they treated Israel when Israel was leaving Egypt on their way to the land of Canaan. You get to Numbers chapter 25 and you read about how it was these Moabite women who seduced these men of Israel who caused this great plague to come upon Israel. You read over in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 7 that Moab worshiped the god Chemosh. 2 Kings chapter 3 tells us those who worship Chemosh sacrificed their children to this god. You read in Judges chapter 3 and verse 14 how it was under the leadership of the king of Moab, Eglon, that Israel was oppressed for 18 years. What do we know about Moab? Moab was a wicked people. Moab was a people who were enemies of God's people. They were enemies of the Israelites. And here's what happens. There's a famine in the land that apparently causes Elimelech to decide, you know what, we're going to leave the house of bread and we're going to travel over about 50 miles south across the Dead Sea and we're going to go into the land of Moab because there's food to eat. Now it's interesting. Because you think about what Elimelech is doing at this point. And I think he's doing what most of us probably would do, right? I mean, he's just trying to provide for his family. He's just trying to protect his family. And that's what we do, right? We do whatever we have to do for our families. And you know, sometimes there are probably even people here today, you know, that the reason you live in Murfreesboro, Tennessee is because your job brought you here, right? You had to do what was best for your family and it brought you here, and that's why you're here, and we're glad you're here. But perhaps you wouldn't be here had your job not brought you here. There are other people maybe who used to be here who would still like to be here, but their job has taken them elsewhere, and so to provide for their family, they had to follow their job. They had to do whatever was asked of them to provide for their family. So in one sense, I look at this, what Elimelech does here, and I think, okay, he's doing what I would do. He's trying to protect his family. He's trying to provide for his family. But here's what's interesting. The name Elimelech means God is king, or God is my king. And here's a man whose name is a constant reminder that God is his king. He lives in a place that is known as the house of bread, the land of thanksgiving and praise. And yet that man didn't trust God enough. He didn't believe in his king enough to stay. Instead, he moves across into enemy territory in order to provide for his family. So this famine causes this family to move. Look at verse 3. Verse 3 says, "But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And these took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpha, the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." So you see here in this story, a famine takes place in the land. It causes the family to have to move, and eventually you see a fate that is not wanted. Because what was it that caused Elimelech to take his family and uproot them from Bethlehem and move them over to Moab? It was the fear of death, right? They were trying to avoid death, because if we stay in Bethlehem, there's no bread, we may not live. But yet, the very thing they were trying to avoid is the very thing they found when they left the presence of God and God's people and went over to the land of Moab. Elimelech and his sons, they both die. And not only do they both die, and you think about the consequences, and we're not told why they died. Jewish historians, try to say it's because of their actions and what they've done, but we don't know. But they died, the very thing they were trying to avoid. And what's interesting is Naomi, mom, is left, the wife, and her sons at this point, they've married 2 Moabite women, right? And they're left behind. And you begin to understand the dire circumstances that Naomi finds herself in. She's living in a foreign land amongst foreign people with no prospects for the future. There's no kinsman redeemer there to take care of her. There's no one to provide for her. In fact, as you keep reading in chapter 1, what you find out is she's going to tell her daughter-in-laws, hey, you might as well go home, because if you stay here, then I'm not going to marry again. And even if I were to get married, by the time I had a children, it'd be too long for you to wait. You see the fate, right? A decision was made to uproot the family and move the family into this land, a land of the enemy, a land that left the land that God had promised to the people, that he had given to his people, because they didn't trust the king enough. And you think about that. And I think about this story, and I think about, the decision that Elimelech made on that occasion. And I think, in his mind, it was probably a no-brainer. In his mind, it probably made a lot of sense to pack up and to move. I just want to protect my family. But he probably didn't expect that decision that in his mind probably seemed rather small at the time to be a decision that had pretty severe consequences for his family. What I want us to think about this morning is I want us to think about the decisions we'll learn about decisions from Naomi and from Elimelech. And I want to apply that to our own lives. Because we're all prone to make decisions. In fact, we make various decisions every day, and a lot of those decisions may seem to us to be rather small decisions. They may seem to be very insignificant decisions, but what we might find out down the road is what we thought was a small, insignificant decision wasn't so small and insignificant after all. It was a decision that led to something much greater. So when you think about the story of Elimelech and Naomi and their decision they made, the first thing I want you to note is this, that our decisions must be based on what is right. Our decisions have to be based on what we know is right. You know, I think about Naomi and Elimelech here, and I think about what you read there in verse 1. You read how they leave their homeland and they go into this foreign country and they dwell there. And I think they knew that was a bad idea. He probably understood, this isn't the best decision to make. But you know what? Under those circumstances, that was probably the easiest decision to make. And sometimes the easiest decision isn't always the right decision to make. And I think about our own lives, how as we make decisions every day and we make all these various decisions, some big, some maybe seemingly rather small, but every decision I make has to be based on what I know to be right. And when I talk about right, what I know to be according to the Word of God, what God would want me to do. That's what my decision needs to be based off of, not taking the easy way out. I think we can all relate to this. You remember when you were a student, we got some students here, and I'm going to tell you something this morning. If you're a teacher this morning, I'm not going to break any news to you here, but most students do not like tests. We just don't like tests, right? Am I right? Some of you may like tests, and that's okay, but most of us, we don't like tests, and most of us probably have a time in our life where we can think back and we can remember our teacher passing out a test to us, and we look at that test, and immediately we realize, I don't know any of this. I made a bad decision. I didn't study. I made a bad decision. I didn't listen. But lucky for me, that sitting right next to me is one of those smart kids, right? It's one of those kids that always makes an A. Those people, right? And they just happen to have their paper positioned just perfectly for me to see it. And so it's kind of like, well, basically they want me to see the test, right? And so really all I'm doing is I'm giving into their wishes, right? The paper's there for me to see. So, hey, listen, you get this, Doug, right? The paper's right there. I have to do it, right? But by doing that, by taking the easy way out, I'm neglecting to do what I know is right. Because I'm cheating, right? I'm pretending that something is mine when it's not mine. There's so many things wrong with that. And you could go up and explain it to your teacher all day and say, but ma'am or sir, but they put it there for me to see. You know what your teacher's going to say? You're right, they did. That's on them. No, it's your fault. Because you took the easy way out instead of doing what you know is right. I think about in the workplace. There may come a time when your boss asks you to do something that you know to be morally wrong. You know it to be ethically wrong. It's spiritually wrong for you to do that. And in that moment, you have a decision to make. Will I make this decision based on what I know is right? Or will I make this decision based on what's easiest for me? What I think may be best for me? So if hey boss, I can't do that. I can't do what you're asking because that's wrong. That goes against my values. That goes against my morals. That goes against my Christian belief, the foundation on which I live my life. I can't do that. That's the right decision. But the easy decision is to say, well, my boss asked me to do this. And if I don't do this, there'll probably be consequences for my actions. I could possibly lose my job if I don't do what my boss is asking me to do. See, in that moment, we have a decision to make. Will I make the decision based on what I know is right? Or will I make a decision based on what's easiest? When you think about Elimelech and Naomi and the decision they made a decision based on the easy way. Well, this is what's best for us in the moment, instead of trusting in the Lord God. And I think a lot of times that's what happens to us. We make those decisions every day, sometimes even what we think are small decisions. And we make those decisions not based on what's right, but based on what's easy for us. And we try to justify those decisions that we make, taking the easy way out. We'll say things like, well, it's just one time. Or it's just for a few minutes. You know what the problem with trying to justify making decisions based on the easy way instead of the right way? You know what the problem with that is? The problem is that our decisions that we make, even when we try to justify them, they can lead us to places that we never intended to go. That's what we learned from Naomi and Elimelech, right? The decision they made led to a place they never intended to go. I want you to notice what verse 1 says. Verse 1 tells us that they began to go down to sojourn into the land of Moab. The word sojourn there, while it can mean to abide, has the direct meaning of a temporary stay. Right? So in other words, it seems that they're making this decision, a temporary decision. We're going to go here for a short period of time, but eventually maybe we'll make our way back home. Now look at verse 2. Right, they're sojourning to Moab, but verse 2 says they stay in Moab. But then look at verse 4. What's verse 4 tell us? Verse 4 tells us they stayed there for about 10 years. Now the Bible doesn't tell us this. This is just my thought, my opinion. But I believe that when Elimelech and Naomi made the decision, they weren't making the decision to be a long-term thing. I think it was a temporary thing. But they got there and they saw what life was like outside of God's covenant people. They saw what life was like outside the land. They saw what life was like under the law of Moab and not the law of Israel. They saw what it was like to live in that culture. And before they knew it, they were led to a place they never intended to go because they stayed there. And they stayed there for 10 years. You know, the decisions that you and I make on a daily basis sometimes can seem so small and so insignificant, yet those decisions that we make can sometimes lead us places we never intended to go. I mean, I think we all probably know some people who at one time were sitting in a room and they were faithful members of the Lord's body. But little by little, they made these little decisions that at the time didn't seem like a big deal. Well, it's not a big deal if we don't go today. It's not a big deal if we don't attend Sunday night or Wednesday night. It's not a big deal. We're on vacation. I mean, we'll go next week. And little by little, they make those decisions until eventually, you know what happens with those decisions? Those decisions lead places they never intended to be. I didn't intend to walk away from God. It just happened because of all the little decisions that I made along the way. Some of you may struggle with addictions, some heavy addictions. Maybe some of you struggling with addictions that the rest of us, we don't know about. I can't tell you the number of people that I've talked to over the course of my time as a minister and in ministry, people who suffer from addictions, who are having these great issues with these addictions that are destroying their lives. And you meet with them and they all have a common theme. When you talk to those individuals, they will all tell you, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. You know, I didn't mean to find myself down this path, but, you know, I just thought I would do it one time. And that one time became 2 times and 3 times, and before you know it, I was addicted. Or, you know, it was just one look. I mean, just one time, man. I just happened to stumble upon it, and I thought I would never do it again. And now here I am, and my marriage is crumbling because I have an addiction. Because I made what I thought was a small, insignificant decision, and that small, insignificant decision wasn't so small. Because it led me places I never intended to go. I didn't intend to be an addict. I didn't intend to be addicted to porn. I didn't intend to fill in the blank. It just happened. And I think about the decision that they made on that occasion. Maybe they didn't mean to stay for 10 years. But they ended up there for 10 years. And that's how decisions work. We make small decisions sometimes that aren't based on what's right. They're based on what's easy. And they lead us places that we really never intended to be. And here's the third thing I want you to notice. As you look down at verses 3 through 5, our decisions will lead us places that we never intended to be. Then number 3, our decisions can impact other people. Our decisions impact the people around us. When you look at the story of Elimelech and Naomi, you begin to see the impact. It didn't just affect Elimelech. He dies. It affected his sons. They died. But before they died, one of the things that you notice is it says they married these Moabite women. Now, God in the old law had given his people specific commands about specific nations of people. He says, you're not to intermarry with these people. He does that in Deuteronomy chapter 7, Exodus chapter 34. Now, the Moabites are not mentioned in those lists. But you get to Deuteronomy chapter 23 and you find out that the Moabites weren't allowed into the assembly of the Lord. You get to 1 Kings chapter 7 or 11 and you read about Solomon taking wives of these foreign places. It says many foreign wives who turned his heart away from God. You know, the very first one that's mentioned is Moab. So it seems to me that the decision that they made when he moved his family into this pagan land, it was a decision that led to his children marrying women they should have never married. But he made a decision that impacted him. That impacted his children. And those of us who are parents, I want us to understand something. The decisions that we make, specifically the spiritual decisions we make, have an impact on our children. Don't miss that. Every time I decide to put something over the Lord, I want you to understand my children see that. My children hear the message that I'm sending them. Every time I choose to skip worship, I don't want to go today. I don't have a good reason. I just don't want to go today. My children see that. They hear what I'm saying, and that will affect them. Every time I choose to do anything over the Lord, my children take notice of that. You know, as a parent, one of the things you begin to understand is when you have children, you know, it doesn't take long to understand. They catch on to what you're doing. And they start like mimicking you. And they start wanting to be like you and do what you want to do. I remember, you know, Miranda used to tell me, boys, they're going to watch everything we do. Well, everybody tells you that. And then one day you see your children doing something, you're like, where did they learn that? Oh, from me. Right? Like, they're just like me. Right? They're watching our example. And when they see the decisions that we make, sometimes the decisions, spiritual decisions that aren't good for us or our family, I want you to know it affects your children. It has an impact on them. That's what we learn here from the story of Elimelech. His decision affected his sons. But it didn't just affect his sons. It also affected Naomi. Because Elimelech dies, Mahlon and Chilion die, and notice what it says. It says that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Do you understand the significance of that? The significance of that is she had no one to take care of her. Children were, in that culture, children were who were to take care of you. I mean, that's really how it should be today too, but especially in that culture. She has no children to care for. They're dead. She has no family. She's left in the land of Moab. There's no kinsman redeemer for her. Not in Moab. All because a decision was made a decade prior. But in the moment, it seemed like a good decision. But it was a decision that had consequences. I don't want us to ever underestimate the impact our decisions can have on people around us. Our family, our friends, they're watching. And those decisions that we make impact the people around us. Now, if you know the story of Ruth, then you know that what happens next basically is the wonderful story. Ruth's going to make that pledge, right? In verses 16 and 17 where Naomi is going to say, hey, you go back to your father's house. You go back to your own gods. And she says, no. Where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. And your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be married. And you have the story of Ruth unfold. And what a beautiful story it is that in the midst of this decision that this family made, that God could still work providentially to bring about good. And I think that's what we need to understand. Because the truth of the matter is we're going to make bad decisions. And the truth of the matter is there are going to be times in our lives where we make bad spiritual decisions. And sometimes you think about your decisions that you make, and maybe you think to yourself, okay, I've made these bad decisions and I don't know what to do now. Okay, I understand. I've made so many bad decisions. It's affected my family. So many bad things that happened. What do I do now? Well, look at what Naomi did. Because here Naomi is, and Naomi's bitter. In fact, she's going to go back into Bethlehem, and they're going to say, hey, look, there's Naomi. They're excited about her coming home. And she's going to say, don't you call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. Why was she bitter? Well, verse 11 says, she says, the hand of God is upon me. Right? She's blaming God for everything that has happened to her family. And God's not the one that calls them to make the decision. But here's what I want you to notice. You get to Ruth chapter 1, and you get to verse number 6. And look what it says. Then she arose with her daughter-in-laws to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from that place where she was with her 2 daughter-in-laws, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Do you see that? In that moment, she's a bitter woman. She thinks the hand of God is upon her, but she, in that moment, makes a decision. I'm going to leave the country of Moab, and I'm going to return to the land of Judah. What do you do when you make poor decisions? What do you do when you make bad decisions that affect you spiritually, that affect your relationship with God? You don't throw your hands up and say, well, I've made bad decisions, I'm doomed. No. You turn to the only source of hope you have. You turn back to God. That's what Naomi does. She turns around and she makes a decision. You know what? I'm going to go back home. I'm going to go back to the land of my people. I'm going to go back to God and to His people. And she made that decision. And maybe there are some people here today, and maybe that's the decision that you need to make. Because maybe you've wandered away from God. You've made poor spiritual decisions. Maybe you find yourself in a very dire, bleak situation this morning. I want you to know this morning that there's an answer for you. The answer is come back home. Turn back to God and trust that He can forgive you, as Richard talked about this morning, that He can provide for you. That's what God can do if we will lean on His everlasting arm. Maybe you're here today and you've never made a decision to follow Christ. Maybe you've never submitted to Him into the watery grave of baptism. And today you have that opportunity. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, you're willing to confess your faith in Him, to repent of your sins, you can be immersed this morning and to have your sins washed away. No matter how many bad decisions you've made in the past, God will cleanse them. God will forgive them if you will allow Him to do that. Maybe you're here today and you've just wandered away. You haven't been living the life that you needed to live. You need to do what Ruth did, what Naomi did. See, Naomi heard about what God was doing and what God was offering in the land. But it doesn't do any good just to hear. You have to respond. And that's what she did. She responded by taking the steps to return home. And for us today, for you today who've made poor spiritual decisions, then you have the opportunity today to head back home. But I want you to understand that the journey back, it starts with the first step in the right direction. Make that direction toward God this morning. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation this morning, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?